This is going to be an introduction to how to start programming in PHP, connecting to a database and using an abstraction library that's called PDO. Right, well, first of all, maybe a bit of an explanation of what an abstraction library is. Frequently when you're programming in any language, but in PHP, you get different commands according to what kind of database you're connecting to or that you're working with. So if we're working with a MySQL database, frequently you type MySQL something or other, MySQL connect or MySQL query, or if you're working with Postgres, there's a Postgres and connect and whatever. So every time you change database, you have to redo all of the commands that you've used in order to be able to connect and work with that database. And that becomes a bit of a pain in the neck because frequently you want to use one database for testing and then another database in production, or maybe you're working in production and then you decide that you're going to change databases. So the better way to do it is to use an abstraction library, which means you use one common set of commands and then can move to use a different database just by changing usually one or two words. So that's what we're using. Anyway, let's kind of jump in and start. So what we're going to do is carry out a few steps. I think the first thing is I'll start a file and I'll jump straight in and start to code, think out loud, make mistakes, correct the mistakes, and you can learn from that as we go. So I'm using an editor, PHP Storm, lots of different editors out there, and I have produced a web page for you to look at to give you a set of recommendations. I mean, other ones you might use are Eclipse or PHP Edit if you're only working on Windows. NetBeans is very good. But I quite like PHP Storm. I keep on fluctuating and changing my mind and trying different ones. But here I am in PHP Storm. And I've created a new directory for the project. So I'll start a new file. Well, we're going to work in PHP. So your first thought might be, I'll create a PHP file. But at least to start off with, what we're going to do is run PHP inside web pages. So rather than create a PHP file, I'm going to create an HTML file. And this particular demo, I'm going to list customers, so I'm going to call my file customer list, and it'll start as an HTML5 file. This is one slight pain with this interface because it actually creates the file and saves it, because the first thing I want to do is now change its name, and I'm going to save it as though it were called PHP instead. So I've resaved the file, called it PHP, and I actually don't need that version. I probably could have renamed it, but so I'll just delete that. So here I am with a file that's called PHP, although at the moment it only contains HTML. And as you know, in order to write PHP, we write a start PHP tag and then the end PHP tag, which this editor has put in for me automatically. Okay, so what am I going to do? Well, I've got to connect to the database. And I'll write these as comments. I've got to connect to the database. And I must say, I always do this. I always write comments, which are really kind of pseudocode, explaining what my thinking is and saying what it is I'm going to do. And then these comments I leave there, and I write the code in between. And this really helps me. I mean, it helps me realize the similarity between things that on the surface might look different. So I find myself writing connect to database, do blah, blah, again and again and again. And it really helps me remember. So I strongly recommend that you do this. You don't add comments after you've written the code. You write the comments before you've written the code. So I'm going to connect to a database, and then I'm going to construct an SQL query that will extract the data from a particular table for display. And then I'm going to execute that query in some way. And then having executed the query, that'll give me a result set, and I want to iterate or loop through that result set. Okie dokie. So that's kind of basically what I'm up to. Okay. So when I iterate through the result set, obviously I think probably what I want to do is then display a record, a row, in other words, from that result set. And then I'm going to end that particular loop or iteration. Okay, so that's my plan. So in PDO, it's very straightforward to connect to a database. What we do is we create a variable to hold the connection. DB, I'm going to call it, or DBH is sometimes used for a database handle. And what that is going to equal, that variable, is a new PDO connection. And the PDO connection I type in here. Now, this is where the abstraction layer is really useful. If I want to connect to MySQL, I could tell it MySQL and some connection string. In this instance, I'm going to use a much easier database to work with, especially for testing, which is an SQLite one. And MySQLite one is actually, because my file's here, look, it's in this directory called DB. And there it is, a file called ex_customers SQLite. So to connect to that file then, from where I am now in this directory, I'm going to tell it to look in the directory called DB, and it's the file called ex_customers SQLite. Okay. Now, one word of warning here. Here I'm using a relative path because I'm opening this file and I'm connecting to it. Just occasionally, we open this file and this file loads another file that's in a different directory, and you'd be tempted to put the path relative to some other directory and it can catch you out. So sometimes it's a better idea to do an absolute path there. In other words, the full path of where that file is located. And there's another strange thing about PDO. I guess it's trying to be helpful. If I misspell that name to a name that doesn't exist, it doesn't complain and say the database doesn't exist. Very helpfully, it creates a blank one for me. So you never get an error saying it's not there because you just create one by mistake, sort of thing. Okay, so we've done that, and now I've got to construct a query. Well, in order to construct a query, I really need to run the query and test it works okay. And there are two ways. Well, I've got two ways. You might only have one way to do this. One way to do it is you use Firefox as your browser. We use Firefox as your browser, and there's an add-in you can get called SQLite Manager. And if you load SQLite Manager, in actual fact, and I've already opened this, so I'm going to say OK, just open the last database. And this SQLite Manager, in actual fact, opens the database, shows me all of the tables, it allows me to look at the structure of the tables, it allows me to carry out some SQL statement. So I could, for instance, if I want to get all of the customers, type select. And by the way, I never use star for a reason that will become apparent in a minute, at least when I'm programming in PHP or a language like that. I want to know what the names of the fields are, so I'm going to specify them. Customer ID, customer name, and it's case sensitive, and that'll do. From the table that's called X customer. Okay, so let me run that SQL and check it works. Well, there it is. Look, there's my customer ID and there's my customer names, except they're not in alphabetical order, so I'm going to modify that. I'm going to say order by customer name, and I'll try again, and that SQL works. Yeah. So that would be the SQL that I'll copy and use. Now, it's a really good idea to test your SQL first, because otherwise, if you end up with errors in your PHP, you can end up spending ages thinking it's the PHP that's the mistake, or in actual fact, the mistake might just be your SQL. Now, I said I've got two ways of doing this, and that's because in PHP Storm, what I can do is I can configure a database, which in good Blue Peter fashion I've already done by clicking on this button and choosing SQLite and navigating to that directory. So here, from within PHP Storm, I can actually see all of the same information. And in actual fact, I can click on a console window and type in the same kind of information, except it actually will give me hints, which is quite useful. And I can run that, and there's the data in exactly the same way. Yeah, and then I can copy that and paste it. Okay, so either way, it's the same SQL, so I'm going to construct an SQL query. So leaving that as a comment underneath, I'm going to make up a variable to hold this query, and I'm going to call it customer SQL, so that's what it is, and that equals, in quotes, that SQL statement, semicolon at the end. And I always tend to put it in a variable, and the reason for doing that is because if I have an error in my SQL, I can always echo that variable onto the screen and quickly see what my SQL is. That's especially useful when this SQL might be dynamic because it's taking information that's given to you by the user. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is execute that query. Well, in PDO, what it does is return a statement. So I'm going to call my variable stmt for statement. I might call it statement customer if I've got lots of different statements because I was executing more than one command. But here I'm just executing one query and it's only going to give me one statement. And that variable will be equal to my database connection and a method. That's the way you... a method is a function inside this class of things here, and that's the way you do it, minus greater than, and it's got a method called query, and it's exactly the same method whether it's Postgres, whether it's SQLite, MySQL uses exactly the same thing. And my hint here tells me that I can use next a statement which is of type string. So my statement of type string is my variable customer SQL. So what that will do is statement will then in a way equal this record set. It will equal, well, it's easier if I switch to this, it will equal all of those. It will equal all of those rows and all of those columns. And each one of these rows I can refer to individually, which is what I'm going to do next. Because having executed that query, I'm now going to iterate through the result set. So to iterate, I'm going to do while, open parens, and I must admit I always tend to put my end brace in straight away, and my start and end brace, so that I know I'm not going to make a mistake and miss that out. If you noticed, when I typed while, open, close, and that, it automatically put in the end brace so that I could just carry on typing. It was just so happened I'd already got some comments, which is why I did that kind of manually. So while what? Well, it's going to fetch out one row of information at a time. So what is that row of information? Well, it's a customer. So let's make up a variable called customer, which is my row of data. Each individual customer is pulled out one at a time. And I'm going to work with that statement, and I'm going to call a method of that statement object, which is to simply fetch an object. Okay. And we can actually insert parameters in there, but in this context we don't need to do that. So all I'm going to do is work on the statement, which is the entire record set in a way that's been brought back, and I'm going to fetch the first object into this variable called customer. So now I'm going to display a row of data, and so I'm going to echo my customer object and one of the fields inside it. And again, this is now an object, so I can refer to the attributes of that object in the same way that I could refer to the methods of this object by just referring to the field name. And that's why I always write the field names rather than put star, because it helps me remember what those field names are. So I'm going to display, well, I'll just display one actually, just to prove it works. Customer name. No, I'm not. I'm going to do both. Echo what the customer name is, and echo what the customer ID is. Or rather the other way around. Customer ID and customer name. Okay, let's see what happens when I do that. So we'll save this file and go to my web browser and refresh this page, which is I've created. I'm using localhost. You might well have yours on your server, but I'm using localhost, and I've got a directory where I've got my work created. So there's customer list. If I click on it, that's all of the information that I've output. Now it's all on one line, all joined together, because I've just echoed 2 pieces of data. So it would be better maybe if I made that prettier. So let me echo a table, semicolon, and then I'm going to echo inside quotes here a table row, some table data. I've got customer name and customer ID. So just doing all of those. TD, and now in that row. Okay, bear with me. So inside that column there and that column there, I want to put this information. So just grab hold of that, cut it, and paste it in there. Now, you can normally just embed any variable inside a string, as you know, just like that. But if it's a more complicated variable, which is what this is, like it's an object referring to an attribute, or if it were an array, then what you have to do is embed such a variable, a more complicated variable, inside braces, so that it helps delineate what the variable is. We know that the variable starts there and ends there. So do exactly the same here. Put those in, grab hold of that, and drag that into there. Okay, so I'm echoing all that. To make it a bit more easy to read, then I think what I might do is split that up and space it out a bit like so, so that it just makes that a bit easier for you to understand, for me to understand what I'm echoing. I'm echoing a row with columns containing that information. And finally, I'm going to echo the end table. Notice that I'm doing this in PHP. I've not come out of PHP mode, by doing an end one of those, just in order to be able to write in HTML the word table. I think it's easier to stay in PHP mode and echo things. It makes it much easier for you to debug your code, rather than if you come in and out of PHP and HTML, all because you want to avoid an echo statement. That's kind of a bit daft, really. Okay, so save that, and let's see what the upshot of that is. When we refresh the page, there it is inside a table. Let's actually view page source, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so that's it. I've got some indentation happening, except it's not indented. That should be on its own line, and that should be on its own line. If you remember, because we've studied this before, if you put a \n when you're inside double quotes, what that actually does is put that onto a new line. So if I put \n there as well, it should put that onto a new line. So if I refresh that page and view source again, it's put those onto new lines. I could even tab that in if I wanted to, and I should put a \n there. But I think it's a good idea to try and get your source code to be formatted insofar as you're able. So we're going to \t there to tab that in. And what else was missing? Yeah, the TRs. The new TR isn't on a new line. So at the end of every end TR, I want to put that on a new line. So we save that version of it and refresh the source. Yeah, and it's starting to kind of look a bit more ordered. Not perfect, I have to work on that, but you get the idea. Okay, so kind of relatively straightforward, I think. Fairly straightforward. Let me just run through it. We connect to our database, putting the path to the database, and although I've used a relative path, occasionally it's better to use an absolute path, in other words one that goes right from the root of wherever you are. And remember, even if you're on Windows, we're in web and PHP world here, so you don't use backslashes, in other words slashes that lean in the other direction. You always use forward slashes, as you would expect to see on a website URL. I construct some SQL, and I've tested that SQL beforehand. I execute the query to get hold of a statement using db -query, and then I'm going to iterate through that result set by using the fetch object method of the statement, which fetches back a row of data and I've stored that row of data into a variable which I've called customer because that's what I'm looking at. And then I'm simply echoing that row of data object, the customer object, minus greater than and the name of the field. And I wrote out the names of the fields to make it easier to refer to. And by the way, these are case sensitive. If you misspell that, need to be in lowercase, for instance, I should get an error where it's saying customer name is undefined. It's because there's no such thing as customer name, it's customer name with a capital N. Okay. Now, one further thing you might want to do, you're going to be connecting into your database constantly from different places. So it might be a good idea to take that connection information, extract it from there, and we'll create a new file altogether. So in here, I'm going to create a new, and this time it is a PHP file because there won't be any HTML in it, and I'm going to call it dbconnect.php. And inside here, I could just insert that information, and then, well, I'll do it and show you. And then inside here, I can say I'm going to call it dbconnect.php. Okay, so what that does is require that file. That file contains my connection information. Now, just to prove it still works exactly the same. Now that's really useful, especially if that file contains your password and various things like that, and then your password changes. It means I only have to alter it in that one file instead of having to go and alter it in every file which I've connected to. There's one slight problem with this, which is that the variable db is defined inside here, and yet here I am in here and I refer to db, and you might think, well, where did that db come from? It's not very clear where that variable is defined because it's not defined in sight, so to speak. So rather than just have this as a plain file, I'm going to make a slight variation on it, and I'm going to create a function that's called, I'm going to call it getConnection. And what a function does is it returns a value. So I'm going to make it return that db variable. So in this function, we make the connection and we return that variable. Okay? And it could be called anything. We could call it connection. It doesn't matter what we've called it here. And then here, I can say, okay, you get that file and then create a variable here, which I happen to be calling db, but it needn't be called the same thing at all. And what does that db equal? Well, it equals the get connection which I've just created. Okay, so what will happen is it will require and read that file and then call that get connection function, which will return this variable. And actually, just to prove it, let's call this here connection. And I'll call this variable connection. Okay, so it's creating a variable called connection, it's returning that variable called connection, and here it's calling this function, getting whatever the value is of that thing that was returned and storing it into a variable on this side we've called database. And the upshot will be is it will work exactly the same. That was me just refreshing the page. I'll click there just to prove it. And it's worked exactly the same. So that's a slightly cleaner and better way of doing it because it's more obvious where that variable comes from. It comes because I've called this function. Okay, over and out. Thanks a lot.